From the very beginning of my work, I observed that trauma does not arise solely from an external event, but from the psychic rupture it leaves behind. In the case of Bruce Wayne, the murder of his parents was not merely a tragedy. It was the collapse of the structure that organized his entire emotional world. When a child loses those who embody safety, care, and protection, the mind does not simply grieve, it fractures. And in that fracture, an abyss forms, a space where fear and longing become inseparably entwined. This, I must insist, is the wound that shaped the man who would later become the Dark Knight. In a young child, the parents function as the primary regulators of emotion. They soothe fear, make sense of confusion, and provide the ground upon which the ego grows. Bruce's parents were violently taken from him in a moment of helpless terror, leaving no time for farewell, comprehension, or closure. Such an abrupt severing creates what I would call a psychic shock, a blow not only to the heart, but to the very possibility of trusting the world. Bruce did not simply lose two beloved figures, he lost the internal foundation that allowed him to feel safe within his own mind. Many assume that time heals these wounds. I have found the opposite. When trauma occurs before the ego is fully formed, the mind becomes structured around the loss itself. The child begins to see danger everywhere, because danger has already invaded the most sacred place. Bruce Wayne's phobia of vulnerability, his aversion to emotional intimacy, and his compulsive need for control are not personality traits. They are survival mechanisms, born from a night when safety was revealed to be an illusion. The trauma becomes the blueprint of his psyche. Adults often ask why Bruce does not simply move on, why he cannot let go of the past. But they misunderstand the nature of early trauma. The child who witnesses such horror does not interpret the event rationally. He internalizes it as a fundamental truth about the world and about himself. For Bruce, the world is unpredictable and cruel. Love is fragile, happiness is temporary, and most devastating of all, he is powerless to protect what he cares about. These beliefs harden into the very architecture of his identity. He does not remember them, he is them. Another aspect must be considered: the absence of mourning. Healthy grieving requires a secure environment in which the child can process the pain with support and tenderness. Bruce was thrust immediately into isolation, physically, emotionally, and symbolically. Surrounded by wealth but deprived of warmth, he lacked the relational container needed for healing. Without this container, mourning remains incomplete and transforms into a frozen, timeless form of suffering. This is why the death of his parents continues to feel present to him, as if it happened yesterday. He is not living in the memory. The memory is living in him. Furthermore, the sudden loss of parental figures at such a young age disrupts the child's ability to differentiate between external threat and internal fear. In Bruce's mind, the world became divided into only two categories: those who harm and those who must be protected. This moral absolutism, often praised in the figure of Batman, is in truth a psychological scar. He fights crime not because he seeks justice, but because he is reenacting the primal helplessness of that night, trying to reverse the irreversible. Each criminal he confronts symbolizes the man who stole his parents from him, and each confrontation is an unconscious attempt to rewrite the past. It is important to note that the trauma is not simply the loss, but the void it leaves behind. Nature abhors emptiness, and so does the psyche. Bruce fills this void with mission, obsession, and an unyielding sense of duty. But these are substitutes, not cures. They prevent the abyss from swallowing him, yet they also ensure he can never step away from the darkness that defines him. His crusade is both his salvation and his prison, a structure built upon the ruins of his childhood. Thus, the murder of Bruce Wayne's parents is not merely the beginning of his story, It is the gravitational force pulling every aspect of his life into orbit. His fears, his values, his compulsions, even his heroism, all are shaped by that foundational wound. And until the unconscious pain of that night is confronted, rather than acted out through endless battles, the man behind the mask will remain a child, frozen in trauma, forever searching for the safety that was stolen from him. I must begin by saying something uncomfortable, yet essential. The child who witnesses a catastrophe almost never escapes the burden of guilt. Even when he is objectively innocent, even when no action of his could have altered the course of events, he secretly believes he played a role. In Bruce Wayne, I observed this mechanism in its purest form. The tragedy that tore his family apart left not only a wound of fear, but a lingering whisper. I should have stopped it. I could have saved them. And this whisper becomes the real tormentor, far more relentless than the murderer who pulled the trigger. The psyche of the child is primitive, magical, and omnipotent. It believes it controls the world through mere wishes or impulses, and thus, it also believes it causes harm through forbidden desires or unconscious fantasies. Bruce, in the depths of his mind, clings to the belief that he should have acted differently, walked another street, shouted sooner, been braver, stronger, older. These fantasies of alternative realities are not harmless musings, they are chains. They bind him to an impossible task, to correct the past by punishing himself in the present. This unconscious guilt becomes the organizing force of his personality. Every night patrol, every bruised rib, every criminal he hunts is a symbolic act of reparation. What he could not do for his parents, he attempts to do endlessly for the city. He imagines that if he can prevent enough suffering, he will eventually erase the unbearable sense that he failed the two people he loved most. But guilt is never satisfied. It has an appetite that grows as it is fed. With each victory, Bruce feels even more responsible for the next. The cycle tightens around him like a psychological noose. What moves me most is that Bruce does not consciously recognize this guilt. He speaks of justice, duty, vengeance, and moral clarity. But behind the mask, in the corridors of the unconscious, he is still a small boy bargaining with fate. He tries to prove, again and again, that he is not the weak, powerless child who froze on the night of the murder. Yet every triumph reinforces the underlying idea that his failure was real. Otherwise, why would such endless reparation be required? This guilt also serves another purpose. It protects him from facing the true horror of randomness. To accept that his parents died because the world is chaotic and cruel would destroy his sense of meaning. Guilt, paradoxically, offers him control. If he believes he was responsible, then at least the tragedy was comprehensible, the world predictable, and the suffering connected to his own actions. It is easier to feel guilty than to feel helpless. One might think that such guilt would diminish with age or reflection, but in reality, it calcifies. It becomes not merely an emotion, but an identity. Bruce does not simply feel responsible. He believes he is the kind of person who must be responsible for everything. He sees threats everywhere, dangers that others ignore, because he assumes that failing to act would once again lead to irreversible loss. Thus, his hypervigilance is the adult expression of a child's fear of failing his parents. I must confess that among all the psychic conflicts I have described, this one is particularly tragic, because it is self-perpetuating. Guilt keeps Bruce in motion, motion prevents mourning, and the absence of mourning sustains the guilt. He is trapped in an internal loop, forever trying to accomplish what no human can, the undoing of a moment that has already passed. Without confronting this guilt directly, he will continue to live in service of an event he cannot change. And so, as I observe the man beneath the cowl, I see not a hero carved from iron, but a boy carrying the unbearable weight of a mistake he never made. His crusade is not merely a war on crime, it is an eternal attempt to absolve himself. And as long as this unconscious guilt governs him, he will never find peace, only temporary relief followed by deeper torment. For guilt, when it has no basis in reality, is the most unrelenting prison the mind can build. I must begin by clarifying a fundamental principle of psychoanalysis. Fear is never merely an emotion, it is a formative experience. In the case of Bruce Wayne, fear did not simply visit him in childhood, it shaped him, pressed itself into his psyche like a stamp sealing wax. And when he later chose the image of the bat as his symbol, he was not engaging in theatricality or aesthetics. He was returning to the very nucleus of the childhood terror that once rendered him helpless. This is not coincidence, it is destiny shaped by the unconscious. Children do not merely fear external objects, they fear what those objects awaken inside them. The bats of Bruce's youth were not only creatures of darkness, they embodied the chaos, fragility, and nameless dread that lived in his inner world after the loss of his parents. When he dons the cape and cowl, he is not becoming a bat, he is becoming the terrifying feeling itself. He believes that by embodying the thing that once overwhelmed him, he can master it. This is a form of identification with the aggressor, a defense mechanism I have often observed in the psyche, but rarely in such dramatic form. What fascinates me is that this identification is not simply symbolic, it is transformative. Bruce does not hide behind the mask. He becomes the mask. It allows him to invert the original relationship between fear and vulnerability. What once dominated him is now the very tool he uses to dominate others. Yet this triumph is not as victorious as it appears. For when a man fuses with his fear, he does not eliminate it. He carries it everywhere he goes like a second skin. Fear may become his weapon, but it also becomes his identity. By embracing the bat, Bruce is attempting to reclaim control over an early trauma that left him powerless. Trauma always fractures the sense of self, leaving behind a lingering belief that one's core is weak or inadequate. His solution is to build a new core, a persona forged from darkness, discipline, and the projection of terror. He believes that if he can make others fear him, he will never again experience the helpless terror that consumed him as a child. But such a strategy merely externalizes the problem. What he projects outward, he still feels inwardly. This internal paradox creates a unique tension within him. Every night he ventures into the city's shadows, he reinforces the association between his identity and fear. He tells himself, this is strength. Yet strength built on fear is remarkably brittle. It requires constant performance, constant vigilance, constant renewal of the illusion that the darkness is under his command. If he were to pause, even for a moment, the fear he has fused with might rise again, reminding him that it was never truly conquered, only repurposed. One must understand that Bruce's choice of symbol is not therapeutic. It is compulsive. He reenacts the terror of his childhood in an attempt to master it, yet mastery always slips from his grasp. This repetition compulsion, this unconscious need to relive the original wound, drives him deeper into the persona of the bat. He tells himself he does this for justice, but I see clearly that he does it for himself, to tame, each night, the shapeless dread still living in the shadows of his own mind. What troubles me most is that the more he merges with this symbol of fear, the more he distances himself from ordinary human experience. Fear becomes his language, his tool of communication, his method of relating to the world. He becomes a creature not entirely comfortable in the daylight of tenderness or vulnerability. The identity he has built is powerful, but isolating. It offers him control, yes, but at the cost of emotional exile. Thus, I must conclude that Bruce Wayne's greatest misconception is believing that fear can be mastered by wearing it like armor. True mastery would require confronting the original wound directly, acknowledging the small, terrified child within him. Instead, he has built a fortress around that child, made of shadows and wings. And although the world may see a hero, I see a man who has not escaped his fear, but rather lives inside it, calling it by another name. To understand Bruce Wayne's nightly crusade, one must first grasp a fundamental principle of psychoanalysis. Human beings do not simply remember trauma, they reenact it. This is what I call the repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive that pulls a person back toward the very event that wounded them. In Bruce's case, the dark streets, the lurking danger, the violent confrontations, all of these echo the fatal night in Crime Alley. He is not merely fighting criminals. He is returning again and again to the scene of his original helplessness, trying to rewrite its ending. What intrigues me is that, although he devotes his life to stopping harm, he continually exposes himself to the possibility of being harmed. Night after night, he walks willingly into violence and the threat of death. A man who has healed does not seek out the conditions of his trauma. Only one, still controlled by it, does. Bruce believes he is exercising mastery over the forces that shaped him, yet in truth, he is being drawn back by an unconscious compulsion that refuses to let him rest. He is reenacting the night he could not save his parents, except now he plays the role of savior, trying to impose a new outcome. This endless repetition is not accidental. It is ritualistic. Bruce recreates the emotional atmosphere of his trauma with remarkable fidelity. Isolation, darkness, fear, moral uncertainty. Yet he does so under the illusion of control. He tells himself he chooses this life. But when a man's choices mirror his deepest wound so precisely, what we are witnessing is not freedom, but enslavement. He must return to the alley, metaphorically, until some internal verdict is reached. Unfortunately, the unconscious is not rational. It demands reenactment without offering resolution. Central to this dynamic is Bruce's solitude. Trauma isolates, and the traumatized often isolate themselves in turn. By refusing connection, partnership, and vulnerability, Bruce keeps himself in the same psychological position he occupied as a child, alone in the face of overwhelming threat. This solitude is not strategic, it is symptomatic. To allow someone close would risk disrupting the carefully constructed cycle that sustains his identity. And so he rejects intimacy, choosing instead the cold companionship of his own compulsions. He believes that by risking his life, he honors his parents. In reality, he is repeating the emotional atmosphere of their loss. Violence becomes familiar. Danger becomes home. He returns to it not because he enjoys it, but because it resembles the psychic landscape carved into him when he was too young to defend himself. The unconscious has no regard for comfort. It seeks only the reenactment of what it cannot understand. For Bruce, that night is a wound that never ceases to reopen. One might assume that each victory against crime brings him closer to closure, but this is a delusion. Every success merely reinforces the cycle. Each criminal defeated becomes a symbolic stand-in for the murderer he could not stop. Every rescue reenacts the fantasy of saving his parents, and every night he survives, he convinces himself he has gained control over the uncontrollable. Yet the compulsion persists because he's trying to undo something that cannot be undone. The past cannot be rewritten through symbolic battles. The tragedy lies in the fact that this repetition gives Bruce purpose. Without it, he would be forced to face the emptiness left by trauma, an emptiness he has never dared to confront directly. His nocturnal crusade is both his prison and his refuge. It torments him, yet it is the only identity he fully understands. To stop would be to face the raw, unmediated pain of that childhood night. And so he continues, not because he is strong, but because stopping would require a strength he does not believe he possesses. Thus, I must conclude, Bruce Wayne's vigilantism is not the triumph of will he believes it to be, but the persistence of trauma masquerading as heroism. He believes the darkness gives him power, but in truth it binds him. He is not breaking the cycle. He is the cycle, endlessly repeating the night that shattered him, hoping each time for a different ending that will never come. When I observe Bruce Wayne's public persona, the charming, frivolous, extravagant playboy, I immediately recognize it as a defensive construction of the ego. This persona is not merely a disguise, it is a psychological armor crafted to conceal a profound internal wound. In analytic terms, it is a false self, a carefully engineered facade designed to ensure that no one glimpses the depth of his unresolved grief. The man who smiles at galas and feigns superficiality is, in truth, protecting a terrified child who once saw his world collapse. This false ego serves a crucial function. It prevents others from approaching the core of his vulnerability. By presenting himself as shallow and carefree, Bruce ensures that no one probes too deeply into his emotional life. People dismiss him as irresponsible or unserious, and in doing so, they unknowingly comply with his unconscious wish to remain unexamined. Distance is safety, and a man who has suffered catastrophic loss will instinctively create structures that maintain that distance. His wealth, fame, and charm are not luxuries, they are barriers. The contrast between Bruce Wayne and Batman might appear extreme, yet psychologically they are two sides of the same defense. Batman expresses the rage, fear, and moral absolutism born from trauma. Bruce Wayne expresses the denial, evasion, and artificial normalcy meant to hide that trauma. It is a dual system. One persona absorbs the darkness, the other deflects attention. But both masks paradoxically prevent the emergence of the authentic self, the one buried beneath grief and guilt. He is split, not by choice, but by necessity. This public image also allows Bruce to maintain control over how others perceive him. Control is essential to a traumatized psyche. When a man's early life is defined by helplessness, he will devote the rest of his years to ensuring that nothing, not even empathy, catches him off guard. The playboy identity ensures predictability. People treat him exactly as he wants to be treated, with low expectations and little curiosity. In this sense, the false ego is a fortress built not of stone, but of performance. Yet this disguise carries a hidden cost. By maintaining a persona so detached from his real emotional experience, Bruce becomes estranged from his own humanity. A false ego, once created, can become tyrannical. It demands constant upkeep, constant performance, constant pretense. Over time, it ceases to be a mask and becomes a prison. The real Bruce, the one capable of tenderness, vulnerability, and connection, is suffocated under the weight of the caricature he presents to the world. One must also consider the unconscious wish embedded in his public behavior. By portraying himself as immature and incapable, Bruce creates a psychological alibi. If he fails to form intimate bonds, if he avoids responsibility outside his crusade, no one will question it. People will blame his superficial nature rather than suspect the trauma beneath. This is not simply deception, it is self-preservation. It protects him from the terrifying prospect of genuine emotional exposure, which he unconsciously equates with danger. The tragedy, however, is that this false self prevents healing. Psychoanalysis teaches that one cannot integrate the fractured parts of the psyche while hiding behind rigid defenses. Bruce's persona may protect him from immediate pain, but it also isolates him from the very connections that could soften his suffering. The more he perfects this mask, the further he drifts from the possibility of authenticity. The mask becomes a mirror, reflecting only what he wants the world to see, never what he needs to confront. Thus, I conclude that Bruce Wayne's public identity is not merely a clever disguise for Batman. It is a carefully maintained psychological strategy to avoid confronting his deepest wounds. It protects him, but at the same time perpetuates his fragmentation. The Playboy smile is not joy, it is a shield. And like all shields, it reveals the fear of what might happen if one were to lower it, even for a moment. When I examine Batman's relentless dedication to protecting Gotham, I see far more than a quest for justice. I see a symbolic reconstruction of the parental figures he lost. In psychoanalytic terms, Bruce Wayne has transformed his childhood wound into a lifelong mission. He protects others because he could not protect his parents. This is not mere heroism, it is an unconscious effort to resurrect the nurturing presence that was violently taken from him. The city becomes the child he must safeguard, and he becomes the parent he never had the chance to be. This dynamic is rooted in a fundamental principle of the psyche. Unresolved grief often seeks symbolic resolution. Bruce cannot bring back his parents, but he can recreate the conditions of their loss in the form of constant danger, and then master what he once failed to overcome. Each criminal he stops, each life he saves, becomes a small victory against the helplessness that defined his childhood trauma. He is not simply fighting crime, he is perpetually trying to rewrite the moment that shattered his world. In this way, Batman becomes a kind of psychological replacement for Thomas and Martha Wayne. Their compassion becomes his moral code, their absence his motivation, and their memory his guiding force. Yet this substitution is inherently paradoxical. In attempting to fill the void left by his parents, Bruce becomes consumed by the very mission that prevents him from grieving them fully. He does not heal the wound, he keeps it open, using it as fuel. The Dark Knight is not just a hero, he is a monument built upon loss. The obsessive nature of his vigilante work reveals the depth of this attachment. A healthy individual sets boundaries, recognizes limits, and knows when to rest. Bruce, however, refuses such constraints. He patrols until exhaustion, isolates himself from intimacy, and accepts immense suffering as part of his identity. This self-imposed martyrdom is the clearest evidence of his unconscious guilt. He believes he must pay for surviving. Protecting others becomes both penance and redemption, even though neither can truly resolve his internal conflict. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this substitution also represents a form of idealization. Bruce elevates the memory of his parents to such an exalted level that no real relationship can compete. By devoting himself entirely to Gotham, he avoids the risk of forming bonds that might challenge or complicate this idealized image. In loving the city, he loves them. In saving it, he attempts to save them. But this idealization traps him in the past, preventing him from forming a life beyond his trauma. His role as Gotham's guardian also reflects a deeper unconscious fantasy, the desire to restore order to a chaotic world. The murder of his parents shattered his sense of predictability and safety. By controlling the night, by imposing justice where there was none, Bruce tries to reclaim the structure that was violently ripped away from him. The Dark Knight is thus not merely a protector, but an architect of the stability he lost. This is why failure devastates him. Every crime he cannot prevent reawakens the original wound. Yet, this symbolic substitution is ultimately unsustainable. A child cannot become his own father. A man cannot endlessly bear the weight of an entire city without emotional collapse. Bruce's mission cannot give him back what he lost, nor can it soothe the guilt he carries so deeply. The more he tries to save Gotham, the more he sacrifices himself to an impossible task. In this way, he becomes both the grieving orphan and the overbearing parent, endlessly circling the trauma that defines him. Thus I conclude that The Dark Knight is, above all, an expression of Bruce Wayne's longing for the parents he lost. His crusade is an attempt to transform pain into purpose, guilt into action and sorrow into protection. But beneath the armor and discipline lies a simple truth. He is still the boy in the alley, desperately wishing he could have done something, anything, to save the two people whose absence now shapes every corner of his life.